So we were just discussing in part one about how you had now turned to full-time writing after your novel Leaving It to You received a shortlisting. And it was also your first long novel as well. So you made the jump into full-time writing. I'm curious what that new adjustment and balance was like for you.
It was really complicated because, of course, it really wasn't by my choice.
Mm.
I just wasn't well enough to continue working, and so that made the adjustment quite difficult. I was also still physically very weak.
Yeah.
I had to rest most of every afternoon. I could only stand up for between 1 and 3 minutes was my limit.
Mm.
Um, and so it was, yeah, it was just a very difficult period. And so that shortlisting, that let me say I'm a writer. Um, Although I think that for a long time, I still, if you said, what did I do? I really gave the version nobody wanted to hear about, well, I was an occupational therapist, but right now I can't work as an blah, 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 blah. And so I think I actually went through at, what was I? So I would have been 39 by the time I actually had to resign. Um, I really went through what people do when they retire, of like, I don't quite know what I am.
Yeah.
And so it was like the shortlisting gave me permission to be let, I could be an author, but I still didn't quite feel confident saying I was an author as a job. Um, but yeah, and of course now, I love that I have that freedom to be a
Yeah.
full-time writer. But yeah, it was actually a very difficult adjustment.
Yeah. And obviously, like, as you say, it wasn't your choice. It was due to awful circumstances. But oh, in a small silver lining, so much. Hello,
This is Willis.
Willis.
Yeah, Willis, there you go.
Oh.
You always have to make an appearance.
Yeah. But like so much work came out of that period as you became a full-time writer. Many books throughout the 90s, more chapter books and skinny books. Paradise Palace and the sequel Paradise Gold, which is just behind me there. You wrote books in series like this, Alroy's Very Nearly Clean Bedroom, Sally's Painting Room, a lot of books with creativity at the themes, and a lot of really fun books, The Laziest Boy in the World, Dirt Bikes, Mind Blowing, a lot of different works, very diverse and a great variety in the books you wrote, which makes it so much fun to read because every book is always so different from you. But there was one really special book, Wendy, that was special for your career and special for your readers called Ark in the Park by Wendy Orr and Kerry Millard, who people watching, if the illustrations look familiar, Carey illustrated some of the Nims Island books later on and a couple other Wendy books. This actually won the CBCA Book of the Year for the younger readers in 1995, I think it was. But the the book being published, there was a little bit of a journey up to it being published, wasn't there?
Well, there was. So I think Arc was probably about the third book that I wrote.
Yeah.
So it was written well before my accident. Um, and, we look at that now and it looks like a very kind of standard small chapter book. The point was there weren't any books that length at that time. And and maybe that was an advantage to not having any contact with any other writers because we lived out in the country,
Mm.
and not knowing anything about publishing. So I simply wrote stories as they came to me,
Yeah.
and I wrote this one, and it got probably about 11 rejections, I think, but
Wow.
a lot of them were things like it's a really sweet story, but the length is wrong. And then I sent it to Kathy Tasker, and I think this may have actually been the first one that she took. I can't remember now whether it was the Tin Can Puppy or this one, but Kathy took it, and then I think it waited about 5 years before she worked out how to publish it.
Wow.
And there was another book, I think it was Libby Haythorne's What a Star, but I wouldn't quote me on that. It was also about the same length, and she published them kind of together.
Mm.
And after that, I actually got a lot of letters from people who'd rejected ARC saying, we wondered if you could write us a chapter book of, say, maybe 3,000 words, and basically described what I'd done with ARC. And I think the thing was ARC. It was such a book from the heart for
Yeah.
me, because I realized when I'd finished it, it was the story of my childhood, with being nearly always like a migrant, or I suppose I wasn't officially a migrant in my childhood, but an expat, um, and moving all the time. But it was very specifically of when we lived in France, and our landlords of this tiny little house with an enormous garden, and they used to come out every weekend to look after the garden. And they were like my grandparents. And Mema wrote to me, the Christmas before she died, and sent me her usual beautiful Christmas card and said, I hope you don't mind, but I still think of you as my granddaughter.
Oh,
And so they lived long enough to know that it was going to be published. And they didn't, no, sorry, Madame Gunter saw the book in English. She didn't see it in French, but apparently there was like a little shrine to it in their
oh
house.
wow. How
So it was,
special.
yeah, and that is a book that just still really, yeah, kind of warms my heart.
Yeah. I know it's definitely a popular one with your readers. I think it's available print on demand.
Yes,
I
that's
think
right.
it's yes. So people, you can still ask your bookshops to order it. Um, what
And
did
oh, Brenton, I have just made an audio book of it, which I haven't actually
oh,
got on my website yet because I'm, good like that. But I have actually just done an audio book of
oh,
it.
perfect. Okay, so an audio book coming soon, available from Wendy. Oh, that's great. I With such a special inspiration behind the book, Wendy, what did winning CBCA Book of the Year for this? What did that mean to you? For you personally, but for your career as well.
Um, well, for me personally, you mean once I actually understood the letter and stopped reading it, saying, but when are they going to say who actually won? And it, yeah, I really felt, well, I guess an extension of what I felt with when Leaving It to You was shortlisted.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it was an incredible feeling. I think for my career, unfortunately, I still couldn't stand up, uh, for more than a few minutes. I actually just saw the pictures last night in an old album of the award ceremony, and I'm sitting on the stage because I couldn't stand to do the 2 minute acceptance.
Yeah.
Uh, Although I remember putting my stick down. I refused to walk up to get my medal with a stick. And and Carrie Millard's husband ran after me to give it to me because he was so scared I'd fall over coming back. Um, so unfortunately, I wasn't able to really to avail myself of the kind of golden opportunities. And the same with Leaving It to You.
Mm.
Um, I wasn't really able to follow that up, which, realistically probably made my career suffer. That's a time when you, not made my career suffer. I was not able to take the benefit
Mm.
that I might have been.
Right. That full
Uh,
advantage.
you know, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
But it was, yes, an incredible,
Mm.
incredible thing to happen.
Yeah. A few years went by. You were writing many of the chapter books and other novels that I've just shown on screen. But then from your accident, you gave it to a teenage girl named Anna in the YA novel Peeling the Onion, which is a CBCA honor, and seemed to be sold so many copies in Australia, internationally, won so many awards. And I think until Nim's Island, maybe this was considered your sort of classic favorite book by a lot of readers. Um,
Mm.
what what was like obviously it's fiction and it wasn't exactly what happened to you, but can you just say a little bit about what was that process of writing it like? Was it cathartic? Was it really difficult? Was it easy to find a publisher for the book afterwards? What was the process like for you?
Yeah, it's still a complicated answer,
Yeah.
but yes, I think by then I had published one book um with Alan and Unwin, um book that I'm very, very fond of. And HarperCollins had said, I just don't think it'll sell. And Alan and Unwin had really loved it. And it turns out HarperCollins was right. It didn't really sell. um, and so I now had a relationship with two publishers. I actually decided that if I was going to kind of dig into my soul, I probably wanted to use a publisher that I would be able to see in person.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I actually took it to Alan and Unwin.
Mm.
And so it wasn't anything against
Yeah.
HarperCollins. And I'm sure they would have also done a really good job with it. It was purely sort of geographical, I decided. And so I remember saying to Rosalind Price, who was the publisher then, okay, what if I give my accident to a 16-year-old girl? And she said, oh, yes, please. And so that is basically what I did. It was much more autobiographical than I recognized at the time. I, sometimes got quite cross when people said it was autobiographical because I thought it was fiction, but yeah, the girl was fiction. I did make her 17 because
Mm.
I found that a struggle. I thought 17 was significantly nastier than 16 because, she was going to be 18 during the course of the book.
Yeah.
And so I really struggled with that. But so basically, she was 17 when she had her accident. I was 37. Um, Obviously, she was therefore not an OT, part-time writer, wife, and mother. However, all the kind of despair and thoughts and
Yeah.
it wasn't really much difference when I look at it. It was surprisingly not cathartic. And I think to me, that's the really big difference of writing for yourself and writing for publication.
Yeah.
So by then, I really understood what publication meant. I'd say if this had been the book, my first book, it probably would have been cathartic and it would have been a different book. So I think I did know I was able to enter into, all right, these were my emotions. What's different for a 17-year-old? Also, having been a therapist, I did also pull on knowledge of what other people's reaction to trauma was. And also looking at, okay, this happened to me, but is it something that happens to most people? Now, that was a weird one. Put it in if it adds interest.
Mm.
Uh, it was weird. So, just ignore it. Or yes, like basically, I don't think I've ever met anyone who hasn't been through trauma, who hasn't lost a friend, but often who hasn't also gained a friend.
Mm.
And so for this, it was the boyfriend, I think, that she gained. But I felt that this seemed to be quite a universal experience. So that was kind of how I looked at it. Uh, the book itself did actually change a bit as I wrote it. Well, obviously they all do, but to some extent, I remember Rosalind saying, well, the problem is that you started with the climax on the first page. And so, I had to build up to what was the climax of the book. And I really didn't know what that was as I was writing. And then partway through the writing, I was having actually the therapy that has changed my life of cranial osteopathy, um, which is what got me walking and standing. And I had a near-death experience, or I relived the near-death experience when I started one of the sessions. I think because I trusted the therapist so deeply by then that I was able to do it. She said, I wasn't actually even treating you. I just put my hands on your shoulders. And so I went through the near-death experience, which I had always blocked out.
Yeah.
And I realized that actually, if I gave that to Anna as well, that actually gave me the climax of the story. And for the purpose of the story, it was kind of, I want to commit suicide.
Yeah.
But actually, look, I actually refused to die once. I can't waste that. So I guess that part was Anna. I think being a mother, I could not have gone down the route of
Yeah.
seriously thinking about suicide. But 17-year-old girl, I think it would be totally unrealistic
Yeah.
to not think that she would consider it.
Yeah.
So I was able to give her that crunch of realizing that she had actually fought off death once.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so it was powerful. It was sometimes quite challenging presenting it. And because by then I was, well, especially after I had the cranial sacral therapy, which was before the publication, obviously, I was able to do some school visits. I had to do them all seated still with a special backrest. Um, but I was able to do them. And sometimes the reactions were just so powerful. It was overwhelming.
Yeah.
I mean, in a good way, though. Like, and that it sounds a bit trite, but if this book helps one person, and really you wanted to help more than one person if you spend all that time and energy writing it. But as I started to get the reactions, but the first high school visit that I did with it, they rang me the night before and said, you have to know that two of our students were killed on the weekend in a car accident, and one is in hospital and they don't know what's happening. And that was just like the most, I actually breaking out in goosebumps remembering it, because it was really intense. It must have been it was going to be a workshop. So it was a small group. And they literally just pulled their chair. Those chairs were set up in a circle because I think they'd already decided they would just talk about it. We were going to skip the workshop. But it was like they just kind of pulled in closer and closer to me during the talk. And I thought, so this actually does touch people and help, even though it was almost like I don't know why. But over the years, I've had so many letters, and I sometimes have letters from people, like in the last couple of years, people who say, I wrote to you when I read the book when I was 17 and now I'm 40, and this has happened to me and I wanted to write
Mm.
to you again. Or I'm writing to tell you that I was in a really bad place when I was writing to you then, and I'm okay now. That has been incredible
Mm.
to have these letters. Now, Brenton, you're really making me very emotional. My God.
It's the book. It's that's so touching, Wendy. And I think, like you say, some of the responses to it or to books, you say you don't really know why. I sometimes, just as a reader looking in, I don't even think the author needs to know why or can know fully the extent to a book touches a person, but just know that it does in so many ways. And that's just the people who wrote to let you know, not the people who
Yeah.
read it to themselves and didn't write to let you know. And that's what's so special about a story, because it is like I open it and I read it, and it's like you telling me the story directly in that very special relationship. So I'm not surprised at the sort of that raw feeling and raw authenticity that people take from this book, especially. And thank goodness it exists, you know. Of course, what happened to make it exist is terrible, but it really has helped so many people. And I'm sure like everyone's heard of this book, everyone's read it, but if you haven't, you you could do worse than to find a copy and to read it for sure.
And it's still
Oh,
print.
emotional.
But actually, Brenton, when you say that, actually, one of the thoughts that sorry, when you say that it was bad that I had the experience, but good that
Mm.
I wrote it. And I actually remember thinking one night as I was starting to write it, I thought, well, what was the point of having this accident if I don't write about it? Which was, really funny way to word it, because
Yeah,
I certainly don't believe that like it was meant to be so I could
yeah,
write it. That's actually kind of crap.
yeah,
But yeah, but that was what my subconscious came up with
yeah.
this one night.
I know. How funny to look back and remember that. Wow. But yeah, it pays off. Honestly, it does. Um, oh, all goose pimply, as you say. Um, oh, I know we could just talk all afternoon, but I know we have limited time, so I'll jump ahead. Um, that was in the late 90s, and then into the 2000s, you kept going strong. I just want to give a brief shout out to some of the books, some of my favorites. We had some more early readers, like Grandfather Martin was an early reader book. We had a beautiful picture book with Kim Gamble, Arabella, which is such a great book. You wrote for series and chapter books like Aussie Nibbles with Too Much Stuff, and then the Making Track series. You were asked to write Across the Dark Sea, using an item from the National Museum of Australia collection. You also wrote, this is early in the 90s, but I want to just give a quick shout out because it's favorite books of mine is Mickey Moon and Daniel Day books, the Mickey and Daniel books. These are I think they're the Canadian North American covers.
Yes,
They're just two.
that's the Australian
That's the
one.
Australian. And that the stories were all together. I think
Yes, well,
that's
this one
right.
had more stories, and
Right.
yeah, and unfortunately, that's the one that I said really, it just didn't sell that
Yeah.
well.
I I loved it. I remember I read it, The Wedding. I've told you this. The Wedding. I wrote when I was about 8. My first story was a rip-off of The Wedding, but I called it The Wedding Surprise. So it was totally original. And I sent it to 5 Mile Press when I was 9 years old, and they rejected it. I don't know why.
Oh,
So, but how
idiot.
special, I've got a signed copy from you, which is so special.
Oh, that's right.
And and then you wrote more novels. Spook Shack, that's a really great one. Spook Shack. And of course, around this time was uh Nim's Island, which is when book one came out. Um, you've talked a lot about Nim's Island, of course. It's probably one of the ones that you were asked about the most, and the movie. So maybe if we just briefly touch on it, um, is I'm curious just on your view of it now, looking back at the success of the book and the two sequels, Nim at Sea and Rescue on Nim's Island, and the film, the Hollywood film with Jodie Foster and Abigail Breslin, and then the second film with Bindi Irwin. Looking back on all that's happened with the life that this book had, can you believe it?
No, no, it's utterly ridiculous.
No.
And you know, it's in fact, last night somebody wrote and asked if I minded if she wrote a teaching guide for it. And she said, I know there's a lot of teaching guides out there, but there hasn't really been one for neurodiverse children before. And and so I went to the website that she mentioned. I had no idea because nobody's ever actually asked my permission before.
Yeah.
And and I don't know. Well, I didn't look at them all, but there were something like 9 pages of them on this website of teaching guides for New Zealand. And of course, in the States, well, all of North America, but particularly the States, it's used for one school, one book, where the whole community, every family gets a book and they read it together and they spend the term on it
Right.
and like base all their lessons around it.
Right. Wow. See what it's like dropping a pebble in a creek and the ripples. You don't know where all the ripples go, but all the lives that this book has taken on, it's just is amazing. And what a special thing to have in your life, and a special title and achievement to have uh, in your bibliography, of course. So then, you had all the great times with Nim and Nim's movie. You kept writing all through that process, and you got to be involved with the film. I want to shout out to Paula, the producer, who started the whole film project by emailing you that fateful day and getting the film begun. Um, I'd love to give a shout out to two books that you wrote, the Mocky and Bick. Mocky and Big. This is book one,
Well,
the Australian cover, and then the sequel was Mocky and Bick Go to Sea, and I think this is the American cover of that. And I know a really interesting tidbit is that they were sort of inspired by the true story of your dad and his sister when they were children, and that's really fun, zany language in these books as well. Uh, but yeah, what's the sort of story behind those that you'd like to talk about?
well, yeah, they're actually probably pretty well true, except slightly toned down
Hmm.
from their real childhood. Uh, and so the language in it, they did actually speak a twin language. So my dad and his twin sister, they were born in 1930. My grandfather was a room runner on a tall masted ship, used to sail down to Tahiti and pick up rum and take it back to the American states that were, of course, not allowed alcohol. Um, and they lived on a boat in the harbor. Like, so in the book, I have them actually being taught to swim after they fall in. That actually never happened. Nobody ever taught them to swim. They were 3-year-olds living
Yeah.
on a boat. Why would you teach them to swim? They spoke a twin language, which they spoke with their nanny. The parents were
Mm.
not very interested parents. They didn't notice that the kids didn't speak English until they were going to take them to school. And at that point, they actually, I think, fired the nanny, bought a house, and moved um, into Vancouver so that my dad and his sister could actually spend a year at home going to kindergarten and learn to speak English. And they went to school a year late to try and get them socialized. But it was still quite an amazing childhood, really. And so the second book is actually, so that's the second American book, but actually
Yeah.
all those stories are in the Australian book. And I mean, really briefly, like that story, Moki and Bit Go to Sea, that is actually completely true. My grandfather jumped off the boat to, or the dog knocked him off the boat or something. And then the boat actually left with just the twins aboard. And my dad, he was probably 4 by then, but he steered it out to the fuel barge in the harbor. And so when we go back to Vancouver now, I just look at this, we look at this fuel barge, which is still there,
Wow.
and think, my God, this small child steering it out. And my grandfather must have been desperate, running up and down the dock with his children heading out to sea in the
Oh,
boat.
wow.
And heaven knows where my grandmother was. But so they were so much fun to write.
Mm.
The Moki bit came because my grandmother, sorry, my aunt, was called Moki because of the way she said milk. And then I made up the bit to kind of match the Moki.
Yeah.
And on their 80th birthday, they actually wanted Moki and Bick on their birthday cake,
Yeah. Oh.
which was pretty funny. But a bit of advice to writers. Now, it's you who are a very, very well-read person and you know my books. You didn't know how to say it. The point is, it doesn't matter.
Mm.
But if you want to buy a book, when you go into a bookstore, you're not going to ask for it if you don't feel confident about the name. And I think that was a really important factor in the book really not doing well at all.
Yeah.
And some lovely reviews. And also, look, the nonsense language, you have to be quite a confident
Mm.
parent reader to read nonsense language aloud, because that was how I tried to recreate the twin language, was to use spoonerisms and things like
Yeah.
that. So a lot of fun to write. A few people love it passionately, but most people just didn't buy it.
Yeah.
So that's just a little hint. If you want your books to sell, get a title that people can say.